How can we bring sustainability into our daily lives based on our passions and gifts? Because everything needs to change. And if everything needs to change, that means there's enough room for you in this conversation to be who you are and just like shift your own practices to be aligned with your sustainability. Involves everything that you guys talked about. And there's like kind of one more colloquial definition and then one more scientific definition. Colloquially, it means when your community, your economy, and your environment are all acting in harmony, and one of those tiers is not hurting the other tier, and this can go on forever. Scientifically, it's that every single system in the earth, including the carbon cycle, the water cycle, mineral cycle, the biosphere, geology, like every single thing that happens in a cycle never gets thrown out of balance. And that includes our relationship with everything around us. The biggest thing that people seem to talk about in this conversation about sustainability under the environmental tier is climate change. Do you guys know what climate change is?
Yes, will we be okay?
Yeah. Well, it's complicated. It's like, it's complicated. It really is, because like, I believe we'll be okay, but our behaviors are not aligned with that currently, but our mindsets are changing rapidly, and so are our systems. Our projections don't say that we're going to be successful yet, but every single year our projections change for positive results. And by that I mean, like, so for example, Canada had all these greenhouse gas emissions that they would measure every single year, and in 2014 the curve looked like this. And now, based on policy change and intervention and years of conversation, now the curve is starting to look like this. And meanwhile, our goal is like the curve needs to go, like there's a lot more change, but like to see how much that curve changed in 5 years, it's like you can't really know what's going to happen when the target's moving so fast. And like, yeah, we've got a short window to change a lot of things, but we're also capable of change. So that's where I'm at. I'm coming from hope and coming from belief in human potential, but I also think that we need to be grounded in knowing that our current behaviors do not align with beautiful new earth outcomes yet. So sometimes I think of it as like a teeter-totter, and like nature made everything perfectly in balance, or like one of those really beautiful rock balancing systems on a beach, and maybe it naturally flows with the wind, but then we just came out of nowhere and put on like 3 more rocks on one side without thinking about how that would change the motion and the balance in the whole system. There's lots an individual can do. The issue of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed, like I would love the space to touch on emotions and climate anxiety and like grounding those things into spiritual practice as well, like feeling overwhelmed, joining protest, deciding protest is not the way forward. You have to build the solutions yourself, coming to community only to realize that it's not perfect. People go through that trajectory all of the time. Like if you get into activism and go farther down and you're like, this is a solution, no, there's a solution. That carbon footprint is this idea that because we're putting too much carbon into the atmosphere, that every individual person has a carbon footprint, which means pretty much that you divide the amount of carbon that you create as an individual per capita, and then like look at, is this higher than the rate that the average person can give to the atmosphere for climate change to stop or not. And like people in the West will usually have a much higher carbon footprint because we have bigger homes, we're flying, we're eating more meat, versus someone who's living off the land in poverty will have a very different carbon footprint. Also not foolproof, because carbon footprints, I'm pretty sure, were actually invented by Shell in like the 90s or something, so they could offload organizational responsibility onto consumer responsibility. So now the individual gets really, really stressed out about being like, oh my god, I'm emitting all of this carbon. And someone like Shell is not necessarily thinking about, well, I actually can't drill oil anymore. But the conversation is also changing to move past thinking about sustaining and into solutions. So if you think of permaculture, which is something we do on the farm, everything is regenerative. We're thinking about, how can I take this system and make it better? It's not about just sustaining. So sometimes it's even more helpful to think about, how can I like take more responsibility in this space than just myself and make everything better. Things like sequester carbon through reforesting land, or participating in all sorts of different activities that allow us to not only stop the problem but also reverse it. So like that's kind of where the consciousness is evolving into, is not just sustainability anymore. It's like beyond sustainability. In order to get to this place where I can have hope and I can still look at terrible projections every day for 2 years and still go home and have good mental health, like I had to grieve my idealism of what the world was going to look like first. In these conversations that we don't really talk about is like, we talk about the science, we talk about potential solutions, we talk about all the ways that companies are doing terrible things, and we don't talk about, well, I feel overwhelmed when we even start talking about this. So like, where do I even start? It's really hard to know that like our core fundamental relationship between person and earth is really being disrupted. Spiritually, what's really, really helped me is, one, knowing that all things end. And whether it's in 5 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, or 1,000,000,000 years, like Earth will die. And we've never had to think about that before. And like recognizing that for every birth there is a death, and like just knowing that we're in a death portal right now, like whatever that means.
What's a death portal? I'm so sorry.
A death portal is like the spiritual concept of birth and death cycles. So for everything that is born, something also dies. The only thing that we can do to create moving forward is also disrupt. So these energies like always balance out in the universe, and like holding both energies inside of you is normal and really healthy, and like recognizing that death always brings up grief. And then the other thing that's really helpful for me spiritually to like cope with how much things are overwhelming is also knowing that I personally believe consciousness comes before form. So like if we're experiencing this physical reality, it's not indicative of our future ever, because if our consciousness changes, if our ideas change, then our actions change, and our actions change our environment. So like tapping into the pure potential of everything that's alive, and knowing that we're creators, and knowing that things can shift always, and knowing that every 100 years there's been some sort of existential crisis that's like pushed the boundaries of consciousness. Like the last century it was World War I, World War II. Like up until that point they had never had to think about something like that, and it really expanded consciousness. And like this is our issue. Honestly, like grieving climate change and feeling all of these emotions in my body is really what amplified my spiritual awakening to begin with. So like when you're going through all these things, like have compassion for yourself, and like if you're experiencing anxiety or grief, like you don't have to learn more right away. Like you can just go hug a tree and ground and like feel your body and know you're a human, and like it's okay to tend to your emotions as well in all of this. Recognize how far we've come as a species, and we see what's not working, and then we move into solutions. In terms of solutions, I wanted to say, who's talking about sustainability right now? Literally everybody. Every government, every business, every school, every community. I don't know what happened, but like within the last 5 years, I think something has really shifted. There's a position in most major boardrooms right now called the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer. Like that didn't exist 5 years ago. And now suddenly companies like Patagonia are going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And one of the biggest catalysts for that kind of change globally was, well, one, the Paris Agreement, but then also in 2018, the UN released this report, 1.5 versus 2 degree warming, and they put out a lot of different pathways for what the future would look like depending on our behavior. And from that, they concluded that we needed to become net zero by 2050 in order to avoid catastrophic warming. It gave something for everyone to rally around for the first time. And since then, like, Canada has a plan to do this. Like the US is starting to think about it, but they're not really doing too much. Like the UK has a plan about this. Businesses are starting to think about this. And then on the grassroots scale, like people are moving into community, or like talking about regeneration of the soil. Like there's so much happening right now. It's overwhelming. It's like the dam hasn't quite broken yet, but like things are gonna really change in the next 10 years. And in terms of solutions, my approach, based on my own lived experiences, is look at who you are look at your gifts, what lights you up, and then how can you apply sustainability to that. So like, for example, for me, I was like, oh my gosh, I should just never be happy and I should just go work for the government and work on policy change, and that's how I'm gonna contribute to this, and I'm just gonna like put my joy in a box. I'm never gonna open it because the earth is dying. But then after being in that system and realizing that to have something like the Paris Agreement signed, it took thousands and thousands and thousands of people who dedicated their whole career for something like that. And if I want to go have a mini workshop at the Mystical Yoga Farm and community, like, and that lights me up, it's better to follow your bliss than anything else that you're doing, because it'll create sustained action on your part.